Welcome into the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. My name is Tyler Plath, and today we are breaking down our top 12 tight end rankings and placing them into tiers based on our 2023 draft guide. If you want to see exactly how each of us have stat projected these tight ends to perform this year, fellasdraftguide.com, where you'll see stat projections on over 240 players. That is updated every single week, and that is uber important as we draw closer and closer to the beginning of training camp, and that also means the beginning of preseason. Again, fellasdraftguide.com to get your copy today. And as I said at the beginning, we are going into our top 12 tight ends, and we're going to discuss who are some of the best values and who are the players worth investing in this year. So let's not waste another minute, and let's dive on in. We're going to kick things off here with our S tier, and there's only one tight end that belongs in the S tier, and that is Travis Kelce. He's all of our tight end ones this year, and he's really going to be everyone's tight end one this year because there's really no one else that is worthy of the tight end one title this year. Last year, Travis Kelce put up 110 receptions on 152 targets for 1,300 yards and 12 touchdowns. On the year, that was 316 fantasy points, averaging 18.6 fantasy points per game. Those are wide receiver numbers. And if you take a look at his stats compared to other wide receivers last year, here's where Kelce finished in wide receiver stats. He would have finished tied for third in receptions. He would have finished sixth in targets, eighth in yards, second in touchdown. He would have finished as the wide receiver 5 in total fantasy points and the wide receiver 6 in fantasy points per game. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about this. He's the tight end one this year. He definitely deserves to go in the first round of fantasy drafts this year because of the positional advantage that he gives you. It is unmatched, and there is no other tight end quite like Travis Kelce. It's a debate as to where he goes in the first round, but that's not what we're here to discuss. He's the tight end one, and that's why he's in a tier of his own. As I said, there's only one tight end in the S tier, and so we move on to the A tier, and we start off with our consensus tight end 2, Mark Andrews. My tight end 2, Lucas's tight end 2, Cameron's tight end 2. Here's the short story about Mark Andrews' season last year. He had 5 finishes outside the top 20 weekly finishes, but he also had 4 finishes inside the top 3 in the 22nd ranked passing offense per PFF. The inconsistency and a not so efficient offense is what resulted in a relatively disappointing year. Coming off of a tight end 1 season in 2021 and then finishing as a tight end 4, which in the grand scheme of things, still finishing as the tight end 4 is still very, very good. But there were a lot of expectations for Mark Andrews last year, and it wasn't really paid off by his performance last year. What made it even more confusing or frustrating or disappointing is that he ran 128 less routes than he did in 2021. And that ranked 11th of all tight ends. That's kind of frustrating because we all know how much of a receiving threat Mark Andrews is. And for whatever reason, he ran less routes. You can blame it on the quarterback problems. You can blame it on Greg Roman. No one really knows. And that's so frustrating. But despite all of that, there is still optimism for this year. Again, he's our consensus tight end 2, so he's still in the top 3. Here are the reasons why you should be optimistic this year about Mark Andrews. 1, he was first in target share and air yards of all tight ends. 2, he's still going to be the primary option regardless of the wide receivers in the offense. Rashad Bateman, Zay Flowers, Odell, they will be all fighting for the number 2 option because the number 1 option still belongs to Mark Andrews. The third reason for optimism with Mark Andrews is a very similar reason that we had for Lamar Jackson. New offensive coordinator Todd Monken should help improve this offense's efficiency. And we know that Andrews will get volume So if there's an overall offensive efficiency uptick, that's going to benefit Mark Andrews. All those reasons for optimism, plus the talent that is Mark Andrews, makes him another great piece to have in fantasy this year like he has been in the past. Our consensus tight end 3 going into this year is TJ Hockenson, who is the tight end 3 in all of our individual rankings. Hockenson finished last year with 86 receptions on 129 targets for 900 yards and 6 touchdowns. And we take a look at his season last year, and it was really a tale of two halves for TJ Hockenson. First half of the year is in Detroit, where he was 14th in receptions and 9th in targets, but was somehow still the tight end 4, and it was mainly because of a 31-point finish against the Seattle Seahawks, if I'm not mistaken. That performance really helped him out. But again, 14th in receptions, 9th in targets. He then gets traded to Minnesota, and from week 9 to the end of the season, he's the tight end 3. He was second in receptions, only 3 behind Travis Kelce. He was second in targets, only 6 behind Travis Kelce. Hockenson really became Kirk Cousins' safety blanket, as he was 13th in average depth of target with 7.6. So he was occasionally used downfield, but he really was utilized as the safety valve and the safety blanket for Kirk Cousins. Volume is never a certainty when it comes to tight ends. Unless you are Travis Kelce, unless you are Mark Andrews, and now TJ Hockenson. Out of these first 3 tight ends, Hockenson is likely to have the least amount of boom weeks, but he's going to be consistent because of his role. I still believe that TJ Hockenson is still going to be the number 2 pass-catching option in this offense. Maybe by the end of the year, it does become Jordan Addison, but I think for a majority of the year, it's going to be TJ Hockenson. And because of that, I'm not really, worried. I'm not scared off by the threat of Jordan Addison or KJ Osborne, because I think KJ Osborne is fairly disrespected. Again, TJ Hockenson, in my opinion, is the number 2 pass-catching option in this offense until further notice. We'll see by the end of the year. But as things stand right now, the number 2 option in the Vikings offense, that was a very high-scoring offense last year with tons of volume for their receivers, TJ Hockenson is one of the safer options this year. Let's move on to our B-tier tight end, starting with the guy that I probably spent the most time prepping for this video, George Kittle. Last season's tight end 3. This year, he's our consensus tight end 4. He's my tight end 5, Lucas's tight end 5, and Cameron's tight end 4. Last season, Kittle finished with 60 receptions on 86 targets for 760 yards and a career-high 11 touchdowns. Kittle did have an up-and-down season, but his up weeks were wonderful. He had 7 top 10 finishes, and 5 of those were top 3 finishes. From week 14 until the end of the season, he was the tight end 1 with 7 touchdowns. He was averaging almost 2 touchdowns a game the last 4 games of the season. That's insane. And watching back all of his touchdowns, because that's ultimately what helped him finish as the tight end 3 last year, because the volume really wasn't super great. It wasn't on the levels of TJ Hockenson or Travis Kelce, but the touchdowns made up for it. Majority of Kittle's touchdowns were great plays by Kittle. Understanding defenses and using his athleticism and route running and in yak situations. But there were maybe 4 plays that I'd argue were either blown coverages or fluky / low effort defensive errors that led to Kittle scoring. And that's not to say that, I'm saying that last season was a fluke for Kittle. I'm not saying that at all. Because hypothetically, if you took away those 4 touchdowns, he's still the tight end 5 on the year. There's nothing wrong with Kittle in fantasy. But here's what you need to know, and here's what you need to expect if you do take Kittle this year. you are going to get a mix of high performance weeks with some really, really low performances. He averaged 5.5 fantasy points per game where he finished outside the top 15. So when he doesn't finish top 15, it's bad. It is really, really bad. But in games where he finishes inside the top 15, he averaged 20.2 fantasy points per game. You need to buy players like George Kittle because those boom weeks will win you your matchups. And if they hit at the right time like it did last year, right during fantasy playoffs, it could have won you your championship if you had him on your team. It could have won you a championship. So, again, nothing wrong with Kittle whatsoever. He will perform well against teams that aren't great against the pass, and especially against teams that allow a ton of yards and opportunities in the middle of the field. Kittle is still a top 5 option. There's an argument for Kittle to finish top 3 and should be in the top 3, and I understand it. Personally, that's not my flavor, but I get it. If you don't think TJ Hockenson gets the same amount of volume and not as many touchdowns as George Kittle, I can see it. But again, I don't think that'll happen. That's why George Kittle comes in as our consensus tight end 4. Next up in the B tier is our consensus tight end 5, Kyle Pitts. And I heard all the groaning, all the what? I heard it all. Don't worry, we're going to break it down. He's my tight end 4. And again, I'll explain it. Lucas's tight end 7 and Cam's tight end 6. And last year, Pitts finished as a tight end 33 in only 10 games. That was not great, especially after what we saw his rookie year. So let's take a look at what went wrong for Pitts last year. First thing, 59 targets on the season. In 10 games, that's averaging about 5.9 targets a game. We'll round up and say 6. 33 of his 59 targets were deemed catchable, meaning 26 were uncatchable. That's about that's a 59% catchable target rate. That was 37th of all tight ends. Hard for a tight end to succeed when you're not really given an opportunity to catch the ball. So that's not his fault at all. At all. And if I remember correctly, too, he only had 1 drop on the year. So it's not like some of those targets were drops either. There was only 1 drop. So again, not his fault at all that almost half of his targets were not catchable. Secondly, he was used a lot more as a downfield option than 2021. In 2021, Pitts' ADOT was 10.1, still relatively downfield. But in 2022, his ADOT was 13.1. That's a 3-yard difference. And what made it bad is that Marcus Mariota, who was his quarterback when he was healthy, Mariota's deep ball completion percentage, throws of 20 yards or more, was 33rd of all quarterbacks at 23.5%. And Pitts had only 1 completion from Mariota that traveled more than 20 yards in the air. So being downfield is nice, but when you don't have a quarterback that can give you a chance of making a play or making a catch, it's going to make things hard. And not only did we feel that as fantasy managers, I imagine the entire Falcons offense felt it. Third reason for what went wrong with Pitts last year. There was a big decrease in routes ran. In 2021, he ran 467 routes in 17 games. That was about 27 routes per game. In 2022, he only ran 172 in 10 games, which is about 17 per game. He was on pace, his 17-game pace, 292. Yes, Drake London coming in was going to bring that down a bit, and the run-first offense was going to do the same, but averaging 10 less routes per game, that's criminal. For a receiving threat like Kyle Pitts, that's criminal. And at the end of the day, it's a coach's decision if he wants to be a run-first offense or a passing offense. So Arthur Smith can do a run-first offense all he wants. But there was little to no consideration on how to get Kyle Pitts the ball. That decrease in routes ran is probably his most damning stat from last year. But there are still signs of encouragement, and let me explain those to you. First, Desmond Ridder is in, and Marcus Mariota is out. It's not a huge upgrade, but Ridder is a much better passer than Mariota, so more catchable targets means more possibilities, and I'll generalize and say it means more receptions. That's the first thing. Second thing, Pitts had a 27% target share in the Falcons offense, and he led all tight ends in targets per route run. Third reason, he was on pace for 100 targets regardless of how bad things were. And the fourth reason is a stat that you'll hear me use a lot in this episode, and it's yards per route ran, because it's one of the best stats that you can use to predict an upcoming season's production for a player, especially for tight ends. And last year, Pitts was 5th last year. I may still be too high on Pitts, but they're still good in this picture, and I feel much more comfortable taking him this year than last year. Because last year, he's going in the top 3, and if not in the top 3, he's going top 5. This year, he's kind of fringe top 5. He may be going tight end 6, maybe tight end 7 in your drafts because of how bad things went last year for Pitts. Again, I feel much more comfortable taking him this year. There are still signs for optimism. It is not all doom and gloom when it comes to Kyle Pitts. All right, that was a lot of time spent on George Kittle and Kyle Pitts, so we'll speed it back up here with our consensus tight end 6, Dallas Goedert, who was the tight end 12 in only 12 games last year. He's my tight end 6. He's Lucas's tight end 4 and Cameron's tight end 7. Last year, Dallas Goedert was the tight end 5 in fantasy points per game last year, so the tight end 12 finish isn't really a fair assessment of his season. And before missing weeks 11 to 15, Goedert was the tight end 4, averaging 12.6 fantasy points per game. On the entire year, he was on the field for 90% of the team's snaps, and his route participation on the Eagles' team pass plays was 84%. And those stats are important because it means he was on the field a ton and was heavily used in the passing attack. Regardless if he got targeted or not, he was still running routes. That's a great sign, especially when the team brought in A.J. Brown the offseason prior. So despite bringing in an elite weapon like A.J. Brown and having year 2 of Devontae Smith, Goedert still ran a ton of routes and was on the field all the time. Goedert was 3rd last year of all tight ends in yards per route run. There's that stat again. And that is not just a flash in the pan. Goedert was 1st in that stat in 2021. He was 1st in yards per target, meaning good things usually happened when he was targeted. There's little to nothing wrong about Dallas Goedert this year. And to be completely honest, he may be one of the best values, if not the best value, of all tight ends this year. Because right now, he's going at the beginning of the 6th round in 12-man drafts. So you can build up your team for the first 5 rounds, and you can get a stud like Dallas Goedert, who does possess top 5 upside. That's how to effectively build out your team. There's nothing wrong with Dallas Goedert. Like I said, he is a great piece to have and someone that I will probably be targeting a ton in my redraft leagues. Our last tight end in the B tier is Darren Waller, who played only 9 games last year and finishes the tight end 31. He's my tight end 7, Lucas's tight end 6, Cameron's tight end 5. You know the player, and you know the situation that he's now in New York, where he could be very easily the leading receiver on that team. Now, he has played in only 20 games the past 2 seasons. He played only 11 games in 2021, and he played in only 9 games in 2022. And now going into his age 31 season, can we bank on Waller returning to form? That's the question you have to ask. And while I think the concern is understandable, I don't think he's done just yet. In his first game back from his 2021 injury, he had 9 targets, and in his first 2 games in 2022, he finished top 10 in both those weeks. He then gets injured again in 2022, and he comes back for the last 4 weeks of the season, and is the tight end 6 across that stretch, playing with Derek Carr and Jarrett Stidham. Waller and Pitts and one other tight end that we will talk about later in this episode are the high-risk, high-reward tight ends this year, in my opinion, because of their respective reasons. But as long as Waller stays healthy, I don't see a world where he doesn't return on his value because of the situation that he's in. And I would completely understand why someone would feel much more comfortable taking the risk in Darren Waller than the risk in Kyle Pitts, because at least with Darren Waller, it's a question of can he stay healthy versus the risk in Kyle Pitts is what is this offense going to look like? Is he going to be the number 1 pass catching option, the number 2 pass catching option? Is there enough volume for the number 2 the number 2 pass catching option in an offense that's going to lead the league in rushing attempts more than likely again this year? So I would understand if you want to take the risk and the gamble with Darren Waller over a guy like Kyle Pitts. Completely understandable, because there is huge upside, because he, again, can be the leading receiver in New York and the leading red zone target, so he could score a ton of touchdowns this year. That's it for our B tier tight ends, and so we will go to our C tier tight ends, starting with our consensus tight end 8, Dalton Schultz, who was the tight end 10 last year and my tight end 10 this year, Lucas's tight end 9, and Cam's tight end 8. Dalton Schultz signed a 1-year deal this offseason with the Houston Texans, and he's probably going to be CJ Stroud's best weapon this year. Yes, there's Nico Collins and John Mechie and Robert Woods, but I have a feeling that CJ Stroud is going to find Dalton Schultz a lot more often than a Nico Collins or John Mechie or Robert Woods or a Tank Dell, if we want to throw him in there. Going from Dak Prescott and the Cowboys offense, that was one of the highest scoring offenses in the league, to a rebuilding team like the Texans with a rookie quarterback has to mean something. Looking at who is now the offensive coordinator in Houston, Bobby Slowick, the former passing game coordinator in San Francisco who came over with DeMeco Ryans, in seeing that Slowick had at least a piece in getting Kittle back into the passing attack. And you can tell by his route participation, because in 2021, when Mike McDaniel was the offensive coordinator, Kittle's route participation was 80.5%, and then it jumped to 90% in 2022. So that should let you know that despite the rebuilding team, there's an opportunity for Dalton Schultz to be utilized and used a ton within this offense. This offense won't score as much as the Cowboys offense, so this 8 to 10 range feels about right for Schultz. Because, again, he should be utilized a lot in the passing game, but he just won't have many boom weeks because this Texans offense is really going to have to find their footing quickly if they really want to have any sort of fantasy relevance for this year. Moving to our next tight end in the seats here is our consensus tight end 9, Evan Engram, who was the tight end 5 last year. He's my tight end 8 going into this year. Lucas's tight end 10 and Cameron's tight end 9. Last year was probably the best year that we've seen from Evan Engram. Yes, his rookie year was really good, but last year it really seemed like he found his fit with Jacksonville. 73 receptions on 98 targets for 760 yards and 4 touchdowns. He shocked everyone last year. And I think people are forgetting just how good he was in terms of where he was at the beginning of the season and where he finished. Again, he finished as a tight end 5, but during draft season, at the beginning of the season, he was going in the last 3 rounds of fantasy drafts, and if he wasn't, he was going undrafted. No one expected Engram to finish 5th in targets, 2nd in yards after the catch, and 3rd in receptions. Again, great season from Evan Engram. But we're bound to see him regress just a tad this year. And it's really because of the presence of Calvin Ridley. There's no other explanation or reason other than Calvin Ridley is now a part of this offense. The reason why he's still in our top 10, though, is because of Doug Peterson's history with tight ends. We know about Zach Ertz in Philly. We know about even Dallas Goedert in Philadelphia. Doug Peterson always has a way, always finds a way of keeping his tight ends in the passing attack. So, top 5 upside, probably not going to happen this year. But he is still going to be kind of that 8, 9, 10 range like a Dalton Schultz because he will be used in the passing attack in some way, shape, or form. It won't be as much, I suspect at least, it won't be as much as it was last year, but it'll still be enough to keep him in that 8 to 10 and maybe, dare I say, I'll widen the safety net and just say the 8 to 12 range. Now for one of my favorite tight end targets this year, and I'm not even the highest on this guy, it's Chigoziem Okonkwo. He's my tight end 11. Lucas has him all the way up at tight end 8. And Cameron is just trying to be a meanie and try to take away all the fun and joy. And he has him as his tight end 14. There's reasons that Chigoziem Okonkwo could finish outside the top 12. It's really just connected to the offense that he's in. Tennessee's offense is going to be the run-first offense like Atlanta should be as well, but just to an even more extreme because it's Tennessee and you've got Derrick Henry. Over the last 6 weeks of the season, though, Okonkwo had 3 top 10 finishes despite playing with 3 different quarterbacks during that stretch. And if I need to remind you, it was Ryan Tannehill, it was Malik Willis, and it was Joshua Dobbs. He was the tight end 7 overall during those weeks. Okonkwo did finish first in our handy-dandy yards per route run stat and was also first in fantasy points per route run. It needs to be said, that his sample size isn't on the same level as everyone else because he ran the 53rd most routes of all tight ends last year, but he was 2nd in targets per route run. So no matter how you slice it, to be 2nd in targets per your routes, per the amount of routes that you ran, it's very encouraging. That really kind of levels out the playing field just a little bit. This year, it is literally just Chigoziem Okonkwo and Treylon Burks as the main pass-catching options. Yes, Kyle Phillips is there. Yes, Nick Westbrook-Ikhine is there still too. But Okonkwo and Treylon Burks will be 1 and 2, and it's up for debate as to who will be 1 and who will be 2, but it's going to be those two guys. Again, we know that this offense is built on the run first. But Tannehill, Levis, or Malik Willis, whoever is in a game at any given moment, have to throw the ball at some point to somebody. Chigoziem Okonkwo is very similar to Dalton Schultz in that there's a lot of optimism, you could say. But you got to recognize the offenses that they're in. So their ceilings are relatively capped. And I believe Okonkwo can be a low-end tight end 1, unlike somebody else in this trio. But really, his range of outcomes is very similar to a Dalton Schultz, to an Evan Engram, where it can be the tight end 8 to the tight end 12. Maybe Cam argues it's a tight end 14. I digress. Chigoziem Okonkwo is one of my favorite targets this year. Moving on to our consensus tight end 11 on the year is Bills rookie tight end Dalton Kincaid. He's my tight end 13, Lucas's tight end 12, and Cameron's tight end 10. Kincaid is an intriguing option this year because of the situation that he's in. Just like Darren Waller, but just different situations. Buffalo needed another pass-catching option to help out Josh Allen because they've really stuck Gabe Davis into that deep threat role. Kincaid has some abilities that other tight ends don't really have coming out of college, which is why he is a very fascinating option this year. Kincaid, he can separate. He has good ball tracking ability. And he has enough speed to win in the seam or going across the field. Now, the downside is that there have only been 8 tight ends that have scored more than 140 fantasy points in the last 23 years. Can Kincaid put up more than 140 fantasy points? I think he can, and I think the other fellows would agree with that. But there is also a way where he doesn't hit that mark. He does still have Stephon Diggs in the offense, who is going to command at least 150, 160 targets by himself. Let's say it takes him a little longer to learn and understand the playbook, giving Gabe Davis even more time as that number 2 pass catching option in the offense. Or here's another reason. Or let's say Gabe Davis takes a step forward in the coach's opinion, and so he starts and maybe even plays the season as the number 2 option. Kincaid is the other player that I referenced earlier that we can throw into this high risk, high reward conversation, because there are things to like about his game, things that you like about his fit in this Buffalo offense. But if you're going to buy in on Dalton Kincaid, you have to understand the potential downfall. Again, Stephon Diggs is still in that offense. Let's say Gabe Davis takes another step forward, or Kincaid just takes a while to adapt to the league. If he has a slow start to the beginning of the season, it could cost his chances of being a top 10 tight end by the end of the year. But if that happens, Kincaid then is going to be a buy low candidate. I don't see a world where Kincaid finishes really outside of the top 15, and I'll play it safe and I'll say top 20 for sure. But when you take Kincaid, have a full understanding of his situation. Because if you expect top 10, it could very well disappoint you. Last tight end that will go into our seats here and wrap up this video is Pat Freiermuth, our consensus tight end 12. He's my tight end 9 this year, Lucas's tight end 11, and Cam just absolutely disrespected and buried him all the way to the tight end 15 this year, or for this year. Last year, as the tight end 7, Freiermuth finished with 63 receptions on 98 targets for 730 yards, but only 2 touchdowns. He saw 20 more targets than he did his rookie year. He had 230 more receiving yards than his rookie year, but he had 5 less touchdowns. The silver lining here is that it wasn't just Freiermuth who struggled with touchdowns. It was the offense as a whole, right? Deontay Johnson threw up a goose egg in that department. The Steelers' offense was the second lowest scoring offense in the league last year. And they had to deal with a quarterback change in the middle of their season. I think you can understand that the Steelers' offense last year struggled a ton. And because of that, you saw it in their fantasy performances. When they made the quarterback change and Kenny Pickett came in, from that point till the end of the season, Freiermuth was 6th in receptions. He was 7th in targets, 6th in yards. But it was ultimately the touchdowns that sank him because he only scored once. But here's what we need to know about Freiermuth this season. The offense should score more touchdowns this year. We're going to see some positive regression. And I'm not saying by a lot, but enough to not finish with the fewest passing touchdowns in the league. And yes, Mike Tomlin likes to have his offense be a run-first offense. But he understands that sometimes you do need to win the game by throwing the ball more than you run it. It's not like Mike Tomlin is a Mike Vrabel or an Arthur Smith, where it is, no, we are always running the ball no matter what. Second thing about Freiermuth this season. Last year, in 2021, his rookie year, he was first in red zone targets with 20, but only had 10 in 2022. Cut in half. Again, that should go up with more opportunities to score this year. So despite the down year in the touchdowns for Freiermuth, he still had 10 red zone targets. Third thing you should know about Freiermuth this season. He was 3rd in deep targets and 8th in ADOT, which was a big increase compared to 2021, so they're not afraid to use him down the field more in their passing game. The fourth reason, Freiermuth was 7th in yards per route run. Again, that stat again. And 12th in fantasy points per game with, again, only 2 touchdowns. Being 12th in fantasy points per game with just 2 touchdowns, that's going to go up if you score 3, 4, or 5 touchdowns, which I'm expecting him to do this year. I think he's flying under the radar at the moment. No one will think of him as a solid pick, but I think the metrics will say otherwise, and I think because of that, he is one of the better values in drafts this year because no one's really targeting him. No one is really going after a guy like Pat Freiermuth. He's not someone that you reach on in your drafts. But the point I'm trying to make is there's value with Pat Freiermuth where he's going right now in drafts. And if you can land him, he is much more of a solid pick than you or your league mates will think. That wraps up our consensus tight end 12 rankings and placing them into tiers. Here's a few honorable mentions for you, right? Guys that did perform fairly well last year but did not make our top 12 list. Tyler Higbee, who is our consensus tight end 13 and was the tight end 6 last year. Here's the thing with Higbee. When he was on the field with Cooper Kupp last year, Higbee was the tight end 16, averaging 8.4 fantasy points per game. And the second honorable mention is David Njoku, who's our consensus tight end 14 and was the tight end 11 last year. And Njoku may be a byproduct of a slow start for Deshaun Watson, as I talked about in our top 15 quarterbacks video, which if you haven't watched, you can go find that on our channel, as well as our top 12, top 24 running back and top 12, top 24 wide receiver videos. But if that slow start happens, it's going to impact Njoku. So we could see him finish strong at the end of the year, but that slow start may impact his chances of a top 10 season. As I said, those are our consensus top 12, and I gave you our next 2 as honorable mentions. If you want to see the rest of our tight end rankings, but also our wide receiver, our running back, and our quarterback rankings, again, fellasdraftguide.com. Give this video a like, and if you are still watching at this point, go put in the comments who you are targeting this year for your tight end. And again, go check out our other videos. Our running back and wide receiver and quarterback videos are all up on our channel. Go check those out. Great analysis and all those with intel and info that you need to know going into your drafts this year. So for Tyler and on behalf of Cameron and Lucas, we're signing off here from the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next week.